Hello, members, and anyone listening on the podcast. Welcome back to the Salem witch trials. We're going to continue with the accused. Daniel Andrew, a Salem select man and former deputy to the General Court, was accused, as were his sisters Rebecca, her husband George Jacobs Jr., and the daughter Margaret. Rebecca's father-in-law, George Jacobs Sr., was executed. One Andover selectman was accused, as were family of two others. Convicted witch Mary Bradbury was the wife of Captain Thomas Bradbury, the most prominent settler of Salisbury. Captain Bradbury was the grandnephew of both Sir Ferdinando Gorges, the royalist and Anglican proprietor of Maine, John Whitgift, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Bradbury was a militia officer who had performed long service as Deputy to General Court, as well as local magistrate and judge. Mary Bradbury had been accused of witchcraft years before, but her being cried out upon in this instance may also have been influenced by her husband's officers and his ties to prominent Anglicans and Royalists. Captain John Floyd, or Flood, was accused presumably as a result of his less than successful military efforts on the frontier. Nicholas Frost's father, Charles, was a major in the frontier militia, as was Mary Swain Marshall's brother. Hezekiah Usher was accused soon after his royalist brother, John, was named Lieutenant Governor of New Hampshire. Indeed, John acted as governor, serving for his absentee father-in-law, Governor Samuel Allen. The would-be proprietor who had purchased the Mason family's claim to New Hampshire. Finally, the accused Mary Osgood's husband, John, was Andover's militia captain. Andover's position near the edge of the English settlement made it a likely place for people to see witches. Yet even relatively safe coastal towns consider themselves vulnerable to attack after a raid on York. In the seaport of Gloucester, people began to see native warriors and French soldiers scurrying about. When no actual soldiers were forthcoming, the town's minister, John Emerson Sr., eventually determined they were demons. Yeah, in the shape of Indians and Frenchmen, but they were demons. Produced by the devil and his local agents. In September, Ebenezer Babson, the owner of Gloucester Home, that was the focus of the phantom attack, would accuse Margaret Prince and Elizabeth Dicer of witchcraft. Dicer was a war refuge from Saco, Maine. Presumably, she was living in Gloucester at the time of her accusation at the home of her daughter and son-in-law, Anne and Richard Tarr, who were also Maine refugees. Soon 7 more Gloucester women would be accused. Many people in Essex County had formerly lived on the frontier or had a close relative with frontier ties. The 24 of them were accused, including George Burroughs, who, as we have seen, spent most of his ministerial career in Maine. In Falmouth and Wells, Burroughs certainly would have run across Captain John Alden, whose case exemplifies the perceived spiritual dangers of the frontier and their connection to witchcraft. Alden was a merchant, ship's captain, and militia officer as well, as a founding saint of Boston's South Church. An experienced sailor in his mid-60s, he captained the colony's sloop, Mary, the on-ship Navy of Massachusetts Bay during King William's War. The ship, by the way, was called Mary. Between October 1688 and April 1692, Alden made at least 16 round trips from Boston to the coast of northern New England and Arcadia, and this was on government business. He was a good man for the job, for he had long been trading with the English, French, and Native Americans of the region. He often worked in concert with fellow Bostonian John Nelson, the leading trader to Acadia. In the wartime, these connections brought suspicions, particularly against Nelson, who was an Anglican. Unfortunately, the men's behaviour did nothing to help their cause, as they repeatedly put profits ahead of the best interests of the colony. On diplomatic missions, when he was arranging hostage exchanges, Heldon had almost certainly been illegally selling the enemy lead shot and gunpowder, although he was never formally charged. Rumours about him had been spreading. By late 1690, Alden had been given specific orders to bring no more gunpowder than necessary on his expeditions, indicating that even officials suspected what he was up to. People on the waterfronts of Essex County knew Alden all too well. In August 1691, when Alden arrived in Salem with orders for militia men on the ketch Endeavour to join his convoy headed to the Port Royal, the soldiers refused to serve under him. Alden's old friend and business associate, Bartholomew Gedney, tried to help, but the men would not go. The captain of the Endeavour related to the men generally said that Alden was reported to be an old Indian trader and was going to trade with the French. Therefore, many of them did not wish to hang with him, and they would rather be hanged before they would actually go with him. Magistrates Hathorne and Corwin were ordered to arrest the crew for treason. The several judges on the court of Oyer and Terminer would have known of Alden's reputation. The crew of Endeavour was wise to avoid the trip, for the expedition would prove to be a disaster. Alden, accompanied by his son John Jr., John Nelson and others, was headed to Port Royal to garrison it. They'd made a deal with Massachusetts government to hold the port, in return for a trade monopoly. However, the French sent a force to retake Port Royal, and they captured Alden, his ship, and his associates. They would parole Alden so that he could return to Boston to arrange a prisoner exchange and raise a ransom for the return of the vessel. Yet Alden would take 8 months to return to the Port Royal. When he finally did, in the spring of 1692, he brought only a handful of soldiers the French expected to be exchanged. In the end, Alden would abscond with the ransom money and even seize a French ship, taken while under his letter of safe conduct granted by the French. In the name of profit and greed, Alden would abandon his son, John Nelson, and the others, and it would take years to spring them out of the Bastille, the notorious French prison. By this time, Alden faced even more charges of impropriety from several former captives of the Indians. Pressed into service as a soldier, Mark Emerson had been stationed at Fort Sagadahoc. I don't know what that is, I've never heard of it, on the Kennebec. He was taken prisoner, and the Wabanaki held him captive for more than 2 years. Alden had refused to help him negotiate his release from the natives. When Emerson protested, the captain retorted that he came to trade and not to redeem captives. Emerson noted that the enemy had been in a bad way. Last winter and spring, both French and Indians were forced to eat their dogs and some of their captives for having no powder, and shot could not kill a fowl. But Alden was happy to replenish their munitions and foodstuffs in return for highly profitable fur pelts. For the Indians have a saying that Mr. Alden is a good man and loves Indians very well for beaver. Only several months later, when Alden returned to native village, was Emerson redeemed, his ransom having been paid by John Nelson, himself still a prisoner of the French, thanks in part to Alden. In mid-May 1692, 2 more English captives escaped. They reported that the leader of the French forces in Maine, the Baron Saint Castin, had been promised goods by Alden that he was still waiting to receive. These rumours and statements of Alden's conduct in the war world seemed to confirm the fears that he was in league with the enemy. A part of Satan's grand condition bent on destroying Puritan Massachusetts, Alden's behaviour would lead to a formal complaint of witchcraft being lodged against him on May the 28th. 3 days later, he would appear before the court. He faced the afflicted girls, whom Alden described as those wrenches being present, who played their juggling tricks, falling down, crying out, staring in people's faces. One of the girls said, "There stands Alden, a bald fellow with his hat on before the judges. He sells powder and shot to Indians and French, and lies with the Indian squaws and has Indian papooses." Then Alden committed to the marshal's custody, and his sword taken from him, for they said he afflicted them with his sword. Alden's provision of munitions to the enemy was very well known, and while there's no evidence of his sexual liaisons with anyone, perhaps this was just assumed, given his friendship with Baron St. Castin, who was married to the daughter of the Penobscot sachem Madoc-Wando. There was a constant reminder of that relationship in Boston, where one of the Baron's daughters there resided. She had been taken prisoner by Sir William Phipps in 1690 when he, aided by Alden and the Mary, that would be the ship of course, captured Port Royal. The girl was a servant in the Phipps household, waiting for a prisoner exchange to return to her family. The accusation that Alden afflicted people with his sword, a badge of his military rank, reflected not only fear of the war, but also anger and disappointment at the failure of his leadership. As a sexually charged object, the sword might also allude to Alden's allegedly liaisons with native women. The statement that he had a bald fellow with his hat on before the judges brought concerns of religious orthodoxy into focus, for it suggested Alden was a Quaker. Normally, only a Quaker would refuse to offer hat service. That is, basically, what they say is to remove the hat before superiors. For Quakers believed everyone was equal. Alden was not a Quaker. If he did refuse to remove his hat, presumably it was an angry response to his old friend Bartholomew Gedney. The judge said he had known Alden many years, and had been at sea with him, and always looked upon him to be an honest man, but now he did see cause to alter his judgment. But there were still legitimate reasons to believe Alden might have sympathies for religious radicals. For his mother-in-law, Bridget Phillips, was not just a Quaker, but a daughter of the notorious Antinomian Anne Hutchinson. Bridget and her husband, Major William Phillips, had moved from Boston to Lower Saco River in 1659, presumably because it was a region where Quakers could worship in relative peace. It also was a place of great economic opportunity for a merchant such as Major Phillips. He became a leading magistrate, established a sawmill and trading post at the Falls of Saco in present day Bideford, Maine, and also purchased thousands of acres of land, apparently from Native Americans, though that's just speculative. There's no proof. Phillips turned to his son-in-law Alden to help with these land deals. Alden witnessed two of the deeds, apparently, and presumably the seasoned fur trader was responsible for negotiating the sales with the local Wabanaki. Alden's participation in this native land speculation would have been held against him in 1692 as well. Not only was his family trying to accumulate excessive profits, but they were signing deeds with Native Americans to do so, effectively signing a covenant with people the Puritans considered heathens and devil worshippers. In short, the case against John Alden stemmed from every possible route of accusation: social, political, religious, sexual, geographical, and military. All, however, shared the common element of the frontier. John Alden was one of many accused who had abused his authority. While Alden took advantage of officers to achieve personal gain, others abused their patriarchal authority through physical violence. Reading through hundreds of pages of surviving witch trial court records, we cannot help but be struck by how many of the afflicted maintained that they had suffered beatings and other physical abuse from spectres, a reflection of mistreatment they received in real life. Their accusations may have been made towards those who had inflicted violence, directly or indirectly, such as abetting the natives in the war, as with Alden, against them or their friends, or who were otherwise known for violent behaviour. In early New England, authority figures, particularly men, had considerable latitude in physical physically disciplining their inferiors, wives, children, and servants. There were relatively few court cases involving domestic abuse, but there were limits to what was acceptable corporal punishment, and those who crossed the line were often brought upon charges. Such behaviour was also evidence of a failure to maintain harmonious bonds in the family, which was the most important unit of the Puritan society. 5 of the 6 men put to death by the court of Oyer and Terminer probably would have been viewed as abusive in this regard, for they were specifically accused of having their spectres beat one or more afflicted girls, usually in an effort to force them to sign Satan's book, of course. That's what it's always all about, isn't it? Satan's book. 3 of these men had a history of violence. They were strongly suspicious about the others as well, John Proctor and George Burroughs. Only Samuel Wardwell seems to have escaped claims of having been abusive. Both Giles Corey and George Jacobs Sr. have been convicted in the past for violent crimes. In 1675, in a fit of anger, Giles Corey used a stick to severely beat his hired hand Jacob Goodall, an act that may have led to the man's death. The court fined Corey, though some thought he had gotten away with murder. 4 of the afflicted said Giles Corey or his apparition beat them. Mary Warren specified that he did it with his staff, while when they did question Giles, of course, he said nothing. However, Giles was pressed to death, and Thomas Putnam Jr. wrote to Samuel Sewall to inform him of that well-remembered death of Goodell. Interestingly, Deodat Lawson noted that an ancient woman named Goodall was among the large group of women who claimed to be afflicted by Giles' wife, Martha Corey. In 1677, the court fined George Jacobs for beating John Tamkins Jr. Jacobs landed just one blow, but a witness testified that if not been restrained, Jacobs would have struck him more, he being in such a passion. 12 years later, 5 of the afflicted girls would testify that Jacobs or his spectre had beaten them with his staff or staves, possibly here referring to the walking cane used by the elderly Jacobs. 3 of the afflicted girls said they were struck, beaten or choked by John Willard's spectre, and 4 witnesses testified about the severe beatings he gave his wife. As one put it, for all his natural afflictions he abused his wife much and broke sticks about her in beating of her. Another noted Willard's wife's lamentable complaint of how cruelly her husband had beaten her, to the point she thought she would not recover of the blows he had given her. Neither John Proctor nor George Burroughs had ever been brought before the court for violence, and only one afflicted girl complained of their spectre harming her. But there are still strong suggestions they abused their family authority. When John Indian joined the ranks of the afflicted, Proctor told several villagers that if the slave was in the custody, he would soon beat the devil out of him. He seems to have put this philosophy into practice on his own servant, Mary Warren. One morning on March 25th, Proctor was on his way to Salem village when he encountered Samuel Sibley. Proctor explained that he was going to the village to fetch the afflicted Mary, whom he described as his jade, and then he would thresh the devil out of her. He said that when she was first taken with fits, he kept her busy on spinning the wheel and threatened to thresh her. This seemed to end her fits, at least until Proctor left home. Proctor believed he could end the whole outbreak quickly if he was given access to the afflicted and the whipping post. Warren denied John Proctor and threatened to run hot fire tongs down her throat if she did not sign the devil's book. But she did say that he threatened to burn her out of a fit, presumably with the tongs. Proctor clearly believed the afflictions and accusations were nonsense, and he was willing to use force, or at least the threat of force, to bring it all to an end. Perhaps more disquieting than his suggestion of beatings and whippings was the reference to Warren and his jade, for the slang term suggests a disreputable or flirtatious woman. It is rather odd way for a married 60-year-old father of 11 to refer to his 20-year-old servant, especially when that servant would later testify that she saw Proctor's spectre and would pull it down into her lap Such evidence leads one to speculate if there was more than just a master-servant relationship that meets the eye. Little wonder that some have suggested that several of the afflicted girls, including Mary Warren, might have actually been sexually abused, which is really sad, because it could be true, and this could be trauma representing itself in this, you know? And that's the issue with all of these poor women that were saying they were afflicted, and that's what it's kind of telling us in this part. It's telling us that they were badly abused anyway at home. Even the wives were, you know. So there's nothing suggesting that they weren't sort of fixated in some sort of trauma, maybe, from that, which also led to the accusations being flared up. You know, mass hysteria takes place, and also when you have post-traumatic stress disorder, things can be brought up, and of course there was forgery involved as well, everybody knows that, but the point is, these women did have, when they said the spectre was beating them, they did have a reasonable experience in the actual person beating them. So you can understand where the trauma sort of would come into play, and maybe they would, you know, exaggerate on that a bit, I suppose. And they could have had some mental illness as well from the abuse that they suffered. So, you know, you don't know. If you're not there at the time, you're not them women, you're not going through it, you don't know. And yes, of course there was some fraud, and a lot of it was religious, political, and, you know, all that stuff. But the women that were saying all this, some of those women did really go through a lot of abuse, so it's hard to say how they would have reacted anyway. It could be post-traumatic stress disorder, it could be a mental illness, and they could be reliving what actually happened to them in a courtroom, but saying it's a spectre rather than the actual person that did it, you know. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Salem Witch Trials. We will continue with the accused when we come back. Many blessings.